Hello, and welcome to my presentation, Anarchist Historiography in Mexico, Zapata, the EZLN, and the Longue Durée of Mexican History. I would like to begin by discussing my research question. My desire to study the Mexican Revolution stems from my interest in the current rebellion of the EZLN in Chiapas, Mexico. Having read about the EZLN, a question that remained with me was, why Zapata? The choice of Emiliano Zapata as the banner-bearer of the EZLN revolution has often puzzled historians and challenged their interpretations of Mexican history. Why would indigenous people from the south choose a ranchero or small landholder from the west when the same class of people repressed them in their home state? Why would self-identified anarcho-communists venerate a political figure who desired the codification of landholdings and property rights in his plan for land redistribution? Why would landless campesinos choose a middle peasant as a representative? I believe that we can answer these questions through an analysis of state formation in Mexico. Through a focus on the longue durée of Mexican history, the push and pull between individualist and corporatist institutions demonstrates a clear logic of Mexican governance, narrates the Mexican Revolution, and connects pre-revolutionary indigenous rebellions to Emiliano Zapata and the EZLN. I have organized this presentation into 5 broad sections which correspond generally with the structure of my major research paper. The historiography of the Mexican Revolution, Longue Durée, colonial, liberal, and revolutionary, Zapata and indigenous parochialism in Mexico, clientelism in 20th century Mexico, the EZLN, Zapata, and historiography. In order to begin, I will briefly summarize the 3 waves of Mexican revolutionary historiography. The first wave is often called traditionalist, and is represented by observers and reporters, including historians, journalists, and the revolutionary participants themselves. The second wave, often called revisionist, positions itself as a statistical, economic, and political retelling of the initial popular narratives of the revolution by using Marxist historiography to situate the conflict as one characterized by a push-and-pull relationship between the hacienda and pueblo, or a failure of the Mexican oligarchy to choose a presidential successor to Porfirio Diaz and to modernize the colonial hacienda system. The third wave analyzed regional rather than national conflicts and broadened the scope from archival history to modern political, social, and revolutionary theory. The third school has often challenged both traditional and revisionist histories and has eschewed the flawed grand narrative approach for regional evaluations of the Mexican Revolution. I will term this the contemporary school, as historians are still publishing, evaluating, and critiquing these works. There are 3 major general trends in Mexican revolutionary historiography. First, the activist and participant focus begun by the traditional school and eschewed by the revisionists has returned in the contemporary. Second, the experiential, regional, and parochial approaches have undergone a similar disappearance and return in the scholarly literature. Third, the socialist and revolutionary beliefs of the participants and recorders were replaced by Marxist economic determinism in the historical study of the revisionist, which was subsumed by Gramscian concepts of state hegemony and institutional power in the contemporary school. The main focus of my research has been evaluating and comparing the contemporary and revisionist school. I have undertaken this project because the revisionist school has published the most read and comprehensive monographs concerning the Mexican Revolution. Largely written from a Marxist economic determinist perspective, a critique of these works provides a clear example of the value of anarchist historiography to a re-evaluation of Mexican revolutionary historiography. Beginning in the 1980s, Marxist scholars of the Mexican Revolution published a series of influential monographs which narrated the Mexican Revolution in its entirety. The most prominent are the works of Alan Knight and Ramon Eduardo Ruiz. By analyzing what these 2 historians attribute as the causes of the Mexican Revolution, I will analyze the problems with Marxist economic determinism in a historiographical sense. A major focus of Marxist analysis of the causes of the Mexican Revolution is the hacienda and pueblo conflict. For Marxists, the modernity of industrial capitalism and the economic reality of the agricultural system in Mexico was a major cause of the revolution. Knight argues that the campesino is a feudal latifundista whose failure to transit the change from feudal to wage work is the cause of the economic contradiction which resulted in the material conditions necessary for the revolution. For Knight, the transition between an indigenous peasant and a non-indigenous worker is a fiscal transition, one which is defined in relationship to collective versus individual land ownership or tenant farming on the hacienda. Ruiz, arguing that the Mexican Revolution was not an actual revolution in the European sense, rightly identifies Zapata as a caudillo, but fails to recognize the agrarian nature of the rebellion. Focusing on uneven development, Ruiz situates the causes of the Mexican Revolution as the failure of the state to ensure even access to economic development. This is a notably linear and positivist model, as it suggests the inevitability of development and posits that it was not the modernity of state formation, but rather the economy, that led to the clash of the colonial and modern economic models. These models of the Mexican Revolution have been much discussed and analyzed by the contemporary school. Many scholars, influenced first by Foucault and then Gramsci, have shifted away from a Marxist and positivist focus on economic determinism in order to examine the role that civil society and institutional hegemony had on the causes of the Mexican Revolution. Unlike Knight and Ruiz, John Mason Hart, who published before Gramsci became predominant in historiography, analyzes the causes of the Mexican Revolution from a state formation perspective. Hart uses the Longue Durée of Mexican history to argue that the colonial creation of the hacienda and corporatist institutions allows historians to find the causes of the Mexican Revolution as early as the 17th century. This Gramscian model allows for the answering of some of the supposed contradictions of Mexican history. Why does Juarez rebel against the metropole only to recreate the model through which Maximilian governed? Why does Diaz rebel against Juarez's re-election only to become a perennial president himself? Why in 1910 to 1920 do indigenous peasants rebel on such a large scale? Why does the PRI, a revolutionary party that enshrined in the Constitution the right to overthrow the government, maintain a 71-year dictatorship following the revolution? The answer to these questions lie in the contiguous nature of state formation in Mexico. John Mason Hart extends the timeline of the Mexican Revolution into the 17th and 18th centuries. By focusing on the role of indigenous rebellions against the state and the resistance of indigenous peoples to liberal and individualist institutions, Hart narrates the Mexican Revolution as a continuation of indigenous resistance to the state. The analysis of the Longue Durée of Mexican history shifts the causes of the Mexican Revolution away from economics and political wrangling towards a simple and contiguous process, the resistance to state consolidation and the protection of parochial regionalism. Hart dismisses the transformative reactionary dichotomy of Marxist peasant studies in favor of analyzing the resistance of rural and indigenous people in the context of a desire for regional autonomy and self-governance. Although this is antecedent in Mexican history, it is not a conservative reaction, but rather a means of repelling state penetration by relatively autonomous free pueblos. James C. Scott, in The Art of Not Being Governed, provides a contemporary theoretical basis for this argument in his discussion of the zomia of Southeast Asia. For Scott, it is not fear of modernity, but fear of the hegemonic power of the state that causes indigenous people to move to remote and inaccessible geographies and isolate their own communities. This argument, applied here to Asia and uniting Scott's previous theoretical works, rejects linear modernization theories, opposes Eurocentric models and dichotomies of the civilized and uncivilized, and posits the longue durée of history as being epitomized by the relationship between peoples and the state. Regional analysis of the Mexican Revolution demonstrates a number of Mexican zomias, including the home of Zapata in Morelos. Having discussed Mexican revolutionary historiography and the problems of Marxist economic determinism, let us now delve into the longue durée of Mexican history in order to analyze the causes of the Mexican Revolution. I believe that this analysis will provide a framework to explain the EZLN's use of Zapata's image and legacy. I will posit that Mexican history is epitomized by a waning and waxing of individual and collective political, economic, and social organizations. This macroscopic focus is the promise of Gramscian historical analysis, the emphasis on continuity rather than radical change. The initial problem faced by the Spanish Empire in Mexico after the overthrow of the Aztec Empire was the creation of governable, taxable, and in the words of James C. Scott, legible state spaces. In order to accomplish this, the hacienda was created. This institution, initially governed by former conquistadors, worked with the Catholic Church and the Spanish Empire to bring as many indigenous peoples under the control of the state as possible. Once this colonization by proxy had been achieved, the Spanish Empire had to then contest power with these regional elites. By using and creating collectivist institutions like the Catholic Church and the República de Indios, the Spanish crown attempted to act as an interlocutor between the often brutal and corrupt haciendados and a large indigenous population. These institutions continued in conflict well into the 19th century. The Morelos and Hidalgo revolt, now viewed as a proto-nationalist rebellion, was agrarian in nature and desired to maintain the power of the free municipality from the increasing encroachment of the hacienda and the imperial state. This rebellion, ultimately usurped by the Creole elite, would eventually lead to independent Mexican statehood. Following independence, the Mexican ruling class was divided. Although many historians have focused on economic and ideological differences, in reality, the difference between the conservative and liberal ruling classes is directly reflective of the individualist and collectivist clash. Conservatives, finding power in indigenous labor pools and the Catholic Church, supported collectivist organization in order to maintain their power base. Liberals, often divorced from the hacienda system and residing in Mexico City, relied on the individualist constitution and its precepts of liberal citizenship to maintain their power and control at the cost of the church and indigenous communities. The Reforma, a series of laws and legal changes created under the government of Benito Juárez, radically changed the relationship between individuals and communities in the state. By eliminating colonial protections of corporate identities, mainly the church and the pueblo, Juárez successfully eliminated the conservative power base and began the transition of the Mexican governments towards a strong federal state. Juárez, like Diaz after him, still relied on the parochial and regional elite, often haciendados or regional landowners, in order to maintain control of the Mexican nation. Although many historians have clearly articulated the difference between Juárez and Diaz, from a grand narrative perspective, the two presidents are analogous. Both attempted to modernize the Mexican economy in order to effectively govern and to create an internal empire within Mexico. Both greatly expanded the power of liberal citizenship and the hacendado in order to secure a political power base, and both viewed the indigenous land tenure system as anathema to modernity. During the Porfiriato, however, the delicate balancing act of Mexican governance became significantly more lopsided. Diaz secured federal control of regional governors through ballot rigging, patronage, and the rapid transportation of the reconstituted rurales on newly constructed railroads. Having secured the prominence of liberal individualism and capital-heavy infrastructure development, Diaz committed a fatal mistake in attempting to undermine the power of the parochial elites. By using foreign investment and nepotistic policies, Diaz undermined the regional elites who kept the vast majority of the Mexican populace in control. Without a power base and communal institutions like the Pueblo or the Catholic Church, and without the support of regional elites, his government collapsed and Diaz fled to France. Having articulated an argument against Marxist economic determinism and an argument for anarchist analysis of state formation and the long duration of history, we can now examine Zapata and the Mexican Revolution. Scholars have written extensively on Zapata and his indigenous identity. Varying interpretations from Womack's dismissal of indigenous identity to Rogers' pointed analysis of indigenous cultural coding could be discussed at length. However, for the purpose of my analysis, I will focus on the role that traditionally indigenous cultural constructions had on Zapata's political philosophy and participation in the Mexican Revolution. Many historians have attempted and failed to find the mythical pre-contact indigenous culture in 20th century Mexico. Indeed, by 1900, Mexico was so significantly Hispanicized that few, if any, pockets of contiguous indigenous culture could be analyzed by anthropologists. Although the peoples and cultural practices of pre-colonial Mexico may be gone, the edifices of pre-contact institutions still exist. This praxis, epitomized by the free village, communal landholding, and regional autonomy, still existed in 1900 in the form of the Municipo Libre. Although historians may be divided on Zapata's indigenous identity, it is clear through his defense of the Pueblo and his desire for regional autonomy that Zapata continued an indigenous tradition by resisting federal control of regional matters. This argument is demonstrated clearly by the actual history of the revolution. Zapata rallied behind the Maderista banner as the promises of Francisco Madero's campaign reflected the desire not for land distribution as dictated by the federal government, but for land distribution as controlled by the Pueblo. Madero's initial resistance to Diaz and the Mexican government was based on resistance to increased power of the federal state at the expense of regional elites. This was articulated in the Plan of San Luis Potosí, in which Madero described the elimination of independent elements as a key political concern. Compared to Zapata's Plan de Ayala, however, Madero was unable to articulate how parochial power would be disseminated. When Diaz was overthrown and Madero became president, Madero was unable to make the regional supporters of his rebellion satisfied while maintaining his elite power base in Mexico City. The reason why Villa and Zapata joined Madero, the promise of parochial autonomy, was not effectively instituted during Madero's brief tenure. This failure to act resulted in further rebellion and eventually the Huerta coup d'etat and the assassination of Madero. The desire for parochial autonomy is in fact the guiding factor of the logic of the revolution. Alan Knight, in coining the phrase, articulates the reality of contracted warfare, economic and arms alliances, and the boots-on-the-ground realities as the cause of the varied choices of revolutionary leaders. Gramscian analysis lets us locate this logic within a long duration of state formation and regional resistance in Mexico. Simply put, when the power on the throne no longer needed the regional powers that elevated them, they disregarded the regional goals and provoked further rebellion. This is why both Zapata and Villa shift allegiances during the revolution. Zapata did not desire the destruction of the state and the replacement of a dictatorship of party elites, but rather the return to the promises of legal protection, constitutionalism, and democratic freedom that were destroyed by Diaz, promised and not delivered by Madero, and after the revolution slowly subsumed through PRI dictatorship and corruption. Zapata and his deputies, whether or not they identified as indigenous or practiced an indigenous lifestyle, inherited a historical resistance to the federal state first articulated by indigenous people in the colonial period and continued throughout the modern period by resistance to the hegemonic nature of the Mexican government. The state's rejection of collective political entities and endorsement of the regional elites which it fostered to destroy these collective identities connect Zapata to the contagious nature of indigenous rebellion in Mexico. Through a re-evaluation of Marxist economic determinism and its insistence upon linear models of economic progression as dictated by the 19th century experience of European nation-states, Mexican history has been shown to be a contiguous conflict of local and federal powers exercising hegemony. Anarchist historiography and Gramscian philosophy has allowed this revision and shifted the focus of historiography away from the archive and towards philosophy. In order to successfully narrate the 74 years between the end of the Mexican Revolution and the EZLN rebellion, an analysis of two presidencies will help to clarify the role of indigenous people in the Mexican state apparatus. Lázaro Cárdenas, elected in 1934, developed a number of important clientelist institutions in Mexico. Focused on the working class and non-indigenous peasants, Cárdenas brought many trade unions, cooperatives, and other third-party organizations under the control of the federal state. This co-opting approach, coupled with a populist style, resulted in an increased reliance on the PRI governing apparatus for unions and organizations outside of the state. Cárdenas successfully appropriated not only the petroleum industry in Mexico, but also most means of organizing politically outside of the PRI dictatorship. Importantly for indigenous people, Cárdenas recreated the ejido system, a system of communal land tenure reservations for indigenous communities. Luis Echeverría, serving in the government during the 1968 massacre of students protesting the Olympic Games, would be elected to the presidency in 1970. During his 6 years in office, Echeverría, borrowing a populist approach from Cardenas, successfully incorporated many indigenous peoples into the PRI party apparatus. By creating a series of grand councils, Echeverría empowered indigenous groups who worked within the state apparatus. Essentially, Echeverría created a political process through which indigenous peoples could call upon the state for protection from exploitation of regional elites, as they have often done in Mexican history. Echeverría also significantly expanded the ejido system, often at the cost of regional elites. These policies, assimilationist in nature, attempted to co-opt growing indigenous resistance to the Mexican state following the exposure of the weakness of the government's dicta blanda, or soft authoritarianism. Having discussed the political background of Mexican clientelism, we can now analyze what this meant for the state of Chiapas and the EZLN. Echeverría's indigenous clientelism was not uniformly successful throughout Mexico. In Chiapas, a strong regional elite was able to successfully stymie any attempts to modernize the slave-like plantations called fincas, and continued to control the indigenous peoples of Chiapas. Through a new focus on cash crops like coffee and cattle, indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from their lands and made into internal refugees. Many of these refugees took up residence in the Lacandan jungle, and some maintained a livelihood based on the ejido reservation system, while others faced a brutal reality of low-wage work in the fincas. During this period of immigration, a number of Mexican activists and intellectuals, some involved with NGOs, began to work in Chiapas and develop community and governmental connections. The PRI clientelist apparatus continued to work in Mexico even during the economic depression of the 1980s. But this changed with the introduction of a new political philosophy, neoliberalism. Like its 19th century antecedent, this new form of liberal thought desired to strip the power of communal organizations in order to empower individual ownership, the state, and corporate business. Similar to Diaz's adaptations of Juarez's liberalism, this change was begun without an adequate support base, as the Mexican government had successfully developed clientelist relationships which undermined the power of regional elites. The main effect of neoliberal economics on indigenous peoples was the stripping of communal land ownership rights and the ability of individuals to parcel and sell previously communal ejido lands. This neoliberal individualist attempt to strip indigenous communities of their communal rights was the spark that ignited the powder keg of the EZLN revolution. As regional rebels, the EZLN engaged in a process often repeated in Mexican history: the occupation of towns and villages, the burning of land tenure records, and a series of indigenous reclamations of agricultural land. Although revolutionary and radical, the EZLN mirrored, both through their acts and their communiques, the language and ideas of previous parochial resistance to the Mexican state. Referencing national figures like Juarez, Hidalgo, Morelos, Villa, and Zapata, the Zapatistas called upon the Mexican nation and the world to help overthrow the PRI dictatorship, which they claimed violated the promises of the revolution. Situating their goals within the history of 500 years of struggle, the EZLN took a new indigenous approach to regional resistance, eventually incorporated as autonomous communities with their own government, schools, and hospitals. Under the banner of Zapata, an indigenous rebellion finally resulted in regional autonomy in Mexico. The EZLN's veneration of Zapata from an anarchist historiographical perspective is both obvious and historically relevant. If historians dismiss the Marxist determinist narratives of the Mexican Revolution, which focus on linear progress and economic causes instead of the long duration of Mexican history, it is clear that the cause of most indigenous rebellions, the Mexican Revolution and the EZLN rebellion, is the desire for regional autonomy and resistance to the federal state. This narrative, which Gramscian analysis allows historians to access, resolves many of the contradictions created by Marxist narratives of the Mexican Revolution and provides a valuable perspective for Mexicanists. A focus on the long duration of Mexican history through the lens of regional and indigenous resistance to the state allows for historians to connect the colonial indigenous rebellions to Republican rebellions, the Mexican Revolution, and the EZLN. Through an analysis of Zapata and the failure of previous historians to acknowledge the fundamentally indigenous nature of the Pueblo and its protectors, historians can demonstrate a connection between modern and pre-modern periods and into the contemporary rebellion of the EZLN. By stressing continuity over change, historians can re-evaluate the models of linear progress inherited from positivist historians of the Enlightenment and continued in Marxist economic determinist historiography. These narratives, often created from a desire to see the world in a political lens, have excluded indigenous people from historical narratives through a focus on class-based analysis. However, all people, whether worker, indigenous, man or woman, experience the hegemony of the state and live under its pervasive and destructive reach. By beginning to address these problems within historiography, historians are better equipped to analyze the roots of oppression and provide social, political, and economic alternatives to state domination. Thank you for watching my presentation.